Morning, everyone. Morning. Thank you for being over here. It's a busy day. It's a busy season. So thank you so much for taking time off. Just a few announcements before I hand it to the main speaker. It's Andy Wilson. So first of all, thank you to all our clients for being here. It's the first time I think we've got all our clients under one roof.
So don't talk to each other.
So we've got a whole bunch of clients, and we are going to be tapping into some of this amazing brain power because we've got the marketing head of Aviva, which is over here, strategy and head of China and India, which is Vishwajit here from Volkswagen, the head of marketing, who is to be had, which is sort of, and where is Nishant?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. Head of marketing, Subranch, head of marketing, tourism Australia. We've got brand managers from General Mills, Johnson & Johnson. So thank you all for sort of being over here. And I think yes, Subranch and Visa, where's the Visa team gone? Thank you for being over here. So great to have all our clients under one roof. That's one good reason. The second reason is we've got regional visitors, but I'll explain to you why they're not actually visitors. That's Chris Thomas, who heads the region from Africa to Asia, including the Middle East. Andy Wilson, he's head of planning in Asia Pacific. And interestingly, we are pretty close to our 5th unofficial birthday. And that's because Chris, Andy, and Raj used to work at BBDO Bangkok. They pitched and won PepsiCo business and set up BBDO India. So in a way, Andy and Chris aren't visitors. They were here before actually all of us. So thank you for sort of being back. And of course, good to see our account management, planning, and creative people all over here. So the topic is quite interesting, and I just want to sort of give you a brief glimpse as to what Andy is going to be doing. There's a really long arc between chemistry and I won't tell you what this is, but Andy is going to be taking stuff which is molecular, which is chemistry, right? And he's going to take and he'll sort of quiz people on what this is. But basically, he's going to be sort of connecting chemistry to creativity. And I think the most elegant definition of creativity was, I think, what Arthur Kessler said. He called creativity the defeat of habit by originality. And that's really a beautiful, elegant definition of creativity. So the connection between chemistry and creativity is what Andy is going to sort of be taking us through. So just a brief introduction on Andy. Andy has been leading the BBDO Asia Pacific planning, and it is the most effective planning network. And Andy's teams and he personally have won awards locally at FEs in various countries, at the regional AMEs, which are held in Shanghai, and at Cannes, which is the global awards. So Andy leads the best sort of planning team in the region. With that, I'll hand over to Andy.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ajay. And thanks to everyone for making the time this morning. Can you all hear me okay? It's all right. Yeah, thanks a lot for making the time. I think we've got probably about an hour of me talking with you, at you. I will try and make it interactive, and we'd love any questions as they come through. And then we've designed it so there's going to be a bit of time either at the end as a group for any questions and discussion, or if we're too shy to do that, we can talk further over lunch. I'm going to start with a quick show of hands. I'd like everyone to put their hand up for one of these options. Hands up who's come here this morning for the sex. And how many are coming for the drugs? All right. Some people putting a hand up twice. And how about the rock and roll? Yeah. And how about the advertising? Oh, gee. And that's the point of this talk. And obviously, if we promoted this with a picture of me, we wouldn't get many people. So I don't think the Andy Wilson's much of a draw. Particularly with the expectation of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But I will explain the premise of the title, and obviously it's deliberately trying to hook people in. But I guess what I want to, I've got 3 objectives or 3 goals for this morning's talk, and I'd love your kind of help on these and feedback as we go through. The first is actually relating to the title, and really my passion and my eagerness is that we need collectively to put more sex, drugs and rock and roll and associated activities back into advertising and back into our brands and back into our communications. I believe in my 20-odd years on this job that the corporate culture that we're all part of has actually pushed the sex, drugs and rock and roll, the real spice of life that makes us do what we do, is pushed it to the periphery. And actually we've forgotten about what the kinds of motivations that really drive us to do what we do, cause us to spend our times and money doing what we do. And talking about the primal desires and appetites that make us tick. And I think we really need to kind of wrestle that back. Because that, as I go on to argue, is actually at the core of what drives human behaviour, and therefore your brand health. The second thing I want to do is, in the spirit of agency-client communion. I'm a little bit of a harmony guy. I'm actually, I'm an all peace and love, no war. I like to kind of reach out and have a discussion that maybe can unite agencies and clients around an issue. I believe, and again, I'd love your input on this, that quite often there is a rift or a misunderstanding between the two parties about what creativity is actually trying to do. The agency's obviously got a point of view. We may not declare it that clearly to you guys. You may have a point of view and you may not declare it well to us. And I think that misunderstanding can lead to tension, and ultimately the work and the success of the work is often held victim to that. So, and I think the particular issue, what I'm going to be doing is driving on a particular issue that I believe creates the greatest misunderstanding, and that is the role of emotion in our creative work. Now, clients are wonderful because they're clients because they are empirical, data, evidence-driven decision makers. And when topics such as emotion come into play and get discussed and shared, I can understand, and I see it day in, day out, week in, week out, the suspicion that certain evidence-based people have towards emotion and the power of emotion. So I like to kind of tackle that one head on, and almost ideally act as if that is the troubled water that separates clients and agencies, the role of emotion in our creative work. Perhaps what I'm about to share might provide a bridge, because what I'm actually going to be doing is putting forward a strong scientific argument for the power of emotion. So if you guys are rational thinkers, I'm going to try and give you a rational explanation as to why emotion is more important than rational. So I'm going to try and do that, see how I get on. And the last thing I'm going to do, obviously you can't really tackle these issues without uncovering or addressing what's going on in the human mind and in the human body when we consume creative work and when we make decisions and when we act and behave and consume products. So we're going to have to go there. We're going to have to go into the brain. And this shits me, to be honest. I'm dead scared. I wasn't very good at science, and the whole idea of chemistry is deliberately there because I felt an urge that one has to understand these issues, at least superficially, to really get our business and to really get a better coherent theory about how creativity is working. So my third objective is to try and explain, give you, a soupçon or a little primer in how the brain works. But I'm going to give myself one challenge. I'm going to do it without any diagrams of the brain. Because I don't know if any of you have kind of gone into it and tried to read about neuroscience or watch these videos, and all they give you this brain, and they cut it open and they show a kind of section of the brain lighting up, and they go, see, the brain's working. And it doesn't mean anything to me. So I'm going to try and explain how the brain works without using any reference to the brain. So those are the three things I want to start with, and I think in so doing, provide at least a new to me level of depth as to actually how creativity works. So let's just get going. We've all been inundated over the last 2-3 years around the whole revolution in media consumption. The digital thing has kind of taken over our lives and our jobs. the media fragmentation, the rise of digital and social, and so on and so forth. And that absolutely obsessed us all as we try and master that as we move forward. There is at the same time another huge development and advancement going on that is perhaps less obvious and with less spotlight from our industry, and that is the advancements in brain science and really the popularization of brain science and what it means. And what I've been doing over the last few months is trying to bring those findings and bring those developments into our industry. There hasn't, to my view, been too much great commentary about the role of neuroscience in our industry. A few of the researchers are doing it, and it gets quite technical quite quickly. So I think what I'm trying to do is bring those developments of neuroscience and try and apply them to the work we do. What's been interesting is not just the advancements in the scientific field and the popularizations of those advancements. So more people are becoming aware of them. But we're now seeing it reach out into the realms of life that we're probably we're more comfortable with. So the role of storytelling and the role of narrative is now beginning to receive a better, stronger scientific backing, and the role of music, again, is a subject very, very close to our hearts, and my heart particularly, is beginning to get a much richer understanding of actually why music is such a powerful force and why it's so evocative. So I'm going to be bringing some of these sources to the table and trying to share those with you. And obviously, if any of you guys have done your own journeys in this area, we'd love to hear. I'm going to start with what I think is an outrageous claim, if you think about it. And it's an outrageous claim that we, the agencies, make to you, the clients, probably day in and day out, whenever we present work. That outrageous claim is that in order to be effective, work has to be creative. It's something that we believe very, very strongly, but when you think about it, you've got to ask yourselves, and doing a huge amount of work and research with the IPA, independent to agencies and clients, examining and exploring and measuring the link between creative work and effectiveness. And I'm just going to show you some top line from his work and talk about it, but it's really from him that we get this 11 times. It's a complicated chart, and obviously he has to go through quite a lot of methodological challenges about how you can control or standardize measures of effectiveness, because different categories obviously have different measures, etc. But he standardized it with these two dimensions called extra share of voice and share of market growth, which essentially drives and pulls out the efficiency of a brand's impact to drive a media advantage. And all the dots here are data points from campaign cases that he studied, from which he's got data that have all come from various effectiveness programs, effectiveness competitions, because it's those that provide a database where there is quite thorough data around campaign effectiveness. And he's picked up campaigns from all the available effectiveness competitions from around the world, so this is a global study, and he's plotted them down against these two dimensions. And essentially, the steeper the line, the more a campaign can drive share of market for the same unit of share of voice. And the two lines represent the trend lines of the database that's split into two. He split the database into two groups. The first group, he went through all the campaigns and worked out those that had also won a creative award, which is the green line, and the other group, a larger group of course, which was those campaigns that did not win any creative awards. And he just compared them. And that 11 times is essentially the coefficient of that graph, of those two lines, and that's where he's come with that number. So it's I would say a very robust sample size. There's 400 odd campaigns that he's measured. It's got global validity, and it's got independent credibility as well, because it's coming from somebody outside of the industry. So that's just a little bit of background talking about the observed connection between creativity and effectiveness. And obviously that's very important. It's an important data point. It's almost like when Copernicus or Galileo, I can't remember who, noticed that the Saturn, I think it was, that was moving around in a strange orbit. There was an observation that drove something, but there was as yet no theory as to why that is the case. So it's a great statement of fact. Creative work is more effective. It's measured, but it's not yet explained. And that, I think, is why it's still an outrageous claim. I think unless the agency can provide the start point of how creative work drives effectiveness, I think it still remains a claim that warrants skepticism.
Andy, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I was going to wait, but can you just define effectiveness for me so I can get my head around what you mean when you're talking about it?
Yes, that's a great question. The way Peter Field describes it, obviously, as marketers, we describe it different ways, but essentially it would be an ability for a media investment to deliver an extra unexpected or extra more than normal return on that investment, measured typically by sales, but it could also be by profit and other business measures.
Cases tend to split about 50-50, so that he's basing it on effectiveness cases that are written by often advertisers or their agencies. And so the definition ultimately ends up being the definition that they use. About half of the cases, they tend to use profit as the key return on investment. The other half of the papers, it tends to be about top line sales, and then they don't get into a full profitability analysis. So it depends slightly on the basis of the
But it is still hitting the bottom or top line.
Oh yeah.
It's a commercial outcome.
Commercial.
Okay.
It's not any intermediate measures like awareness or
Right. Okay.
relationship with the brand. It's a sales measure.
Perfect.
As you'll see a little bit later, he picks up on those other ones as well, which I'll touch on. But it is essentially a commercial return on any given media input. Obviously, what he's doing is building in the media investment part of it. So it's essentially about efficiency of return on investment. So as I said, there is an observed difference from quite a rich database, but I think there's still some explanation needed as to how communications actually change behaviour. We're saying that it does, trust us. Creative work changes behaviour, but how does it do it? So that's what I'm diving into, and I think some of the questions I've been asking myself with my colleagues is, what are the levers and causes of decision-making and behaviour? If it's all about behaviour change, which I think we're all agreed on, how does that work? How does that actually happen? And then once we understand those, how can we effectively trigger and pull those levers to our advantage? And once we understand that, then maybe there's an understanding on how the communications and the work and our practice of creativity should be applied or sharpened. So those are really the questions I'm asking. And I've got answers or partial answers to these. So let's just take a step back and kind of figure out this rational emotional thing. It's something that we're pretty familiar with, but I don't think we've nutted out properly. I think, obviously, I come from kind of a Western school of thought, and I'd be interested in your views whether this applies to your own schools of thought. But it goes typically back 2,000, 3,000 years, and really with the Greek philosophers of Plato, etc. And they were the ones, the thinkers, who introspected and observed that there was two modes of thinking that we go through, the rational and the emotional. And that's true, and that's actually been borne out in the science. There are two very different parts of the brain that are responsible for that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But here's what happened. They essentially drove a conversation and some conclusions that said rational thinking must take priority over emotional thinking, or rational action must take priority over emotional action. And just debating that and discussing that, that's certainly kind of replicated in other schools of thought. You see it in Buddhism, I'm sure you see it in Hinduism, and it's often driven by a quest for morality, a quest for social order, and a quest for kind of political stability. And so you'll see a lot of the religious codes would also try and suppress our emotional or appetites and try and invoke a rational control over it, driven either by third parties such as gods, or even from internal such as rational thought and logic or morality. the metaphor that Plato used was the chariot. And essentially, we are all in the chariot, and the chariot's being driven by horses. And those horses are wild. And those horses, unless they're controlled or harnessed, are going to take us off course, into trouble. And those horses represent our appetites, our sexual desires, our indulgences, the 7 sins, call them what you will, those so-called emotions, and those need to be contained and controlled. And what will contain and control them is the rational mind. We've got to put those in check. We've got to suppress them, we've got to rationalize them, we've got to overcome them with duty, obligation, discipline, self-control, etc. I was talking about this yesterday to Rajat, and we thought this could be quite a good metaphor for clients and agencies. That maybe the agencies are the horses, trying to drive your brand into all sorts of crazy places with force and vision, and the clients are holding us back. And it's an interesting thought, because obviously this big war of the emotion and the rationals, the agencies represent the emotions, and you represent the irrational. So there's an interesting metaphor how it kind of translated over. So that's the metaphor, and I think it's been incredibly pervasive. It's it's absolutely driving philosophy in all its forms. It's driving political science. It's certainly driving economic science until about 5-10 years ago, and it was driving policy and all sorts of things, probably psychology as well. And this is what's just been being uncovered and unturned a little bit, because with greater understandings around evolution and brain science and psychology, this is being called into question. And as I said, I don't think this is a Western-only point of view. I think that different prevailing schools of thought have, in their own different ways and their own interpretations, encouraged us, or just set out, first of all, this distinction, rational and emotional, but given what I call an apartheid, a cognitive apartheid, claiming that the rational is somehow more important or stronger or more primary to the emotions. So essentially, let's just reflect on how we operate in our corporate world, how we make decisions, how we persuade people, how we construct arguments. They're all really on this rational basis. We are all Spocks. We all think we're Spocks. We all put our PowerPoint, we all collect the data, we put tables, we fact check, we present rational, logical arguments. I think we do that in the boardroom. I think we do that in the when we're probably reviewing creative work as well. But then we think, we go home and then we talk to our children, or we go to watch a ball game, or we go out clubbing, or we go on a date. And our real lives, as we all know this, our real lives are not this way. Our real lives is that we're actually Homer Simpsons. We do not have very strong kind of discipline and rational control. We are driven by the forces of nature, motivation, biology, and the 7 sins, or the seven troubles. And so, what is this difference? I think this is at the heart of this trouble that we have. That sometimes we're being too Spockish when it comes to developing and especially evaluating work, when in fact the audience out there, when they're consuming our communications and when they're consuming our brands, are in fact Homers. And I think we need to align and work with that. So really the clues to resolving this comes from another guy with a beard, Charles Darwin, obviously before the days of Gillette. As we know, he was the father of evolution theory, and really that's the new scientific approach of how species operate, the survival of the fittest, some of the mechanisms that drive our physiology and our psychology is really what's going to be overturning what was essentially a kind of introspective philosophical stance from the philosophers and the religious folks. And essentially, he was, it all led to kind of how the brain has evolved. And again, I'll give you a very, very simple explanation of how the brain has evolved without invoking brain diagrams. We all know the left versus right brain. And I'm not actually going to invoke that, because that is relevant, but it explains a tiny amount of the variation or the processing of the brain. I'm going to talk more about the vertical evolution of the brain. And I'd like you to think of the brain as an ice cream cone. And the human brain has 3 scoops of ice cream on it. And those scoops have obviously come in order. It started with the basic one. Usually it's vanilla, isn't it, or coffee. And then you put something more exciting and something more exciting on that. And there are clear, very, very clear, you can actually see it with the naked eye, physiological or visible differences between the brain and how it works. So I'll just introduce this, and this starts helping us understand, or introducing the role of emotion. So first of all, you've got the lizard brain, the reptilian brain. I can't remember how many million years ago, 300 million years ago or so. And that is essentially our nervous system, our brain stem, and that part of the brain that just operates the physiological mechanisms, the heartbeat, the breathing, temperature control, all of those things that obviously drive our physical survival. So it drives body function, and it's often called the 4 Fs. And obviously with a topic like this, I will drop my language every now and then, I hope you don't mind. The 4 Fs are, what are they? Fighting, fight and flight, as we all know. Then there's food, and then there's fucking. So those are the 4 Fs. So basically all of those things that will drive the biological survival of an animal.
Not necessarily in that order.
Maybe not in that order. Sometimes they're connected, but yes. So, and we all have that, of course. We are, that is at the centre, at the core of our brain. Then you get what I'm going to call the mammalian brain, which is essentially what we know in the limbic system. And this is where a lot of the action of today is going to happen. As the mammals evolved, they developed much more complex abilities to process stimuli and sensory inputs in a much more complex way. And it gave them really these 4 kind of huge cognitive advantages. Emotions that we'll talk about. And emotions were essentially a way to drive action, very, very quick action. Memories, learning, and the beginnings of very strong social behaviours and complexity. And then Homo sapiens emerged, and the top part of the ice cream cone is the cortex, the crinkly grey stuff that we see. By definition, it's at the top and it covers the whole brain. And it's a hugely, as we all know, hugely complex, sophisticated organ, this part. And that is responsible, or has been identified as being responsible for these major achievements that we've got. Our ability to problem solve, and problem solving involves being able to imagine alternative worlds. We can kind of speculate and hypothesize and work with those models. It's given us language, of course, and all the fantastic things that the technology of language has offered us. It's offered us imagination and complexity. So this is where we get into huge, this is what's driven technology, culture, all of the things that we see all around us is responsible from that, and it's obviously been responsible for driving our evolution. But we just need to recognise that beneath all this, there are some really, really fundamental things going on. And when we think about the brands and the products that we've got and why they're being used, and which part of the brain it's serving, quite often, when we're consumers, we're going to be operating in these areas. As engineers, obviously we need to be complex and so on and so forth, but buying a food product or choosing a soft drink does not require complex problem solving. So let's just now look, now we've got a very, very clear kind of sense of how the brain works. Let's just understand or try and point out where decision making comes in. And this has come out of a book from Antonio Damasio, who's a contemporary. He's still around and still writing. I think the book's about 10 years old. And he's really driven this understanding, discovery of the role of emotions in driving decision making. And one of his anecdotes comes from a person called Eliot, who's one of his people he was studying. Now obviously to understand the brain and how it works, it's quite difficult because you're not really allowed to open up the brain and prod it and move it around. So you have to wait until you get unusual cases of brain pathology, either a tumour or an illness or an accident that has somehow knocked out a part of the brain. And by then investigating and understanding what happens as a result of this destruction, you can make clues and understand what's responsible there.
Who's back? Somebody's music's gone off.
That's right. Good music, bit of rock and roll. So what happened with Elliot? Elliot was a very regular white-collar worker in the US, and he was a clerk or a salesman, very successful, above average IQ, had a family, just a regular guy, just like us. And the poor fellow went down with a tumour. And the tumour was quite rampant, and it destroyed a core part of his brain. But fortunately, the tumour was removed and he survived. And the part of his brain that was affected was actually a bit that came from the mammalian brain. Involved the amygdala and other components of the middle cone, the middle scoop. And Damasio noticed two very, very important kind of consequences of him losing this part of the brain. The first was he lost his emotional abilities. His emotional capabilities were completely removed. So he could feel no happiness and no sadness, no joy, no anxiety. Even when he reflected on his own condition, he had no sense of self-pity or a sense of what a shame or anything like that. He was just absolutely neutral. He was a Spock. And that must have been incredibly disconcerting for his family. You can imagine if you just ripped that out. Now, he didn't mind because he turned into a bit of a robot in his emotional kind of roller coaster. But that was obviously a very debilitating aspect, and he couldn't hold on to his job, etc. So he lost his emotional capabilities. And that was understood, that was expected, because it was the amygdala and that was already known to be responsible for it was your emotional centre. But what was really fascinating is that he lost something else, which was supposedly a rational capability. He completely lost his ability to make decisions. He completely lost his ability to make even the smallest decisions. Physiological behaviours were still going on quite nicely. He could go to the toilet and he could eat and all those things. But his ability to make his mind up had been absolutely obliterated. There's a story that Damasio talks about where the doctor, they were at a session doing psychological tests, and the doctor said, well, when should we meet? And he gave Elliot two choices. Should we meet on Wednesday morning or Thursday afternoon? And Elliot, in his very kind of calm way, began to weigh up the pros and cons of Wednesday morning or Thursday afternoon, and he couldn't stop. He just couldn't stop. He kept rationalizing and processing and analyzing both choices, but he could not make his mind up. So he knew everything about the pros and cons of Wednesday morning, the fact that his wife's not around, so he couldn't get a lift, or this, that, and the other, and on Thursday afternoon, or whatever it was, but there's something good on TV, and whatever it was, he absolutely had clarity of the context and the rational aspects. The analysis was perfect, but the decision-making had been completely gone. And classic analysis paralysis. And what the case goes to illustrate is that it was actually the emotional centre that flips the switch one way or t'other. And actually, when we think about it, if we really think hard and introspect when we're making decisions, it's not coming out of the analysis. The analysis informs it, of course, but when it comes to making the decision, what do? We just choose what feels right. And that phrase is really important. It's what feels right. When you're in the supermarket picking stuff off the shelf, when you're choosing a job, when you're choosing a spouse, buying a car, you can analyze it as much as you want, but at the end of the day, you just choose what feels right. And if you have no sense of feeling, you can't choose. So this was the first kind of understanding and discovery that it is actually the amygdala, which is the emotional center, that is ultimately responsible for making the decision. That decision, in a way, is informed by inputs. Of course, you've got to use your top part of the brain to process the visual things. You've got to recognize it, you've got to understand it, you've got to process the relevance of it for your needs or what have you. But at the end of the day, the emotional center is what's making that decision. And unless as communicators we can reach that emotional center, we're not going to be able to change or affect or influence decision making. And that's really the point behind emotion. Decisions and behavior are triggered by emotions. I'm not saying it's emotional only, but absolutely emotions are necessary to trigger this. In particular, it's the amygdala. So let's just unpack this a little bit. I've got an example here. The clues in the word, emotion, and obviously there's an English analysis of the etymology of the words emotion and motivation, but somebody knew this, that the language has kind of given us a clue that both the word emotion and motivation have come out of the original word movere, which means to move. And obviously motivation is what moves us, and emotion has got something to do with what moves us. And so motivation is being driven by emotion. How they work, again, over just a very, very simple headlines of it. Essentially, and again, we've got to go back to our Darwinism and understand that the brain is developed in order to promote survival and to remove the risk of death. And therefore, this has got a kind of biological or a survival basis to it. Essentially, emotions are the way the brain can make quick decisions. The decisions either to focus on positive things like food or mates, or move away from dangerous things like predators or what have you. And emotions do that. It's a quick way of decision making in the face of complex stimuli. There is the brain can build in, can take in very complex stimuli in terms of objects recognition and what have you. But sooner or later, you've got to move quickly, and the animal that moves quickly and correctly will win that race for survival. And emotions are able to do it. It's a very quick way that does not require that complex cortex processing things. It provides, in addition, so not only do emotions drive an action, but they have that other bit that we know only too well. It has a pleasure or a pain. It has a feeling to it, a phenomenon to it. I'll call it feelings. Emotions provide feelings that act as their own intrinsic reward or disincentive to motivate future behavior. If I like mangoes, if mangoes are good for me, I like mangoes. And that taste of the mangoes, that pleasure associated with mangoes, is an important driver or reinforcer of my future action towards mangoes. If I see a mango again, it will elicit that positive feeling and anticipation. And that again helps me reach out and get another mango. If I don't like spiders, that negative emotion of disgust or fear or whatever it is acting as a disincentive to act again. And it's just the same with brands. People either like your brands or they don't like your brands. It's as simple as that. And if they like the brands, the recognition or on seeing a brand, you'll trigger positive pro-action towards the brand. You'll either reach out or you'll pick up a phone or do something that moves you and your behavior towards that brand. If you don't like the brand, you'll recoil away from it. So behaviors that promote survival and reproductive success are rewarded with positive feelings, and the behaviors that don't are not. So it's all coming from the theory of survival of the fittest. So let's just take an example. A Snickers bar. So you see a Snickers bar, and obviously your top part of the brain processes it. It can read the word Snickers, it can identify all the colours, it recognises it as a Snickers bar, etc. It knows it's chocolate, it might give you a few clues or associations about its calorific content, or whether it's got nuts, or whether it's fattening, and all of that stuff is processed. But at the end of the day, that process comes into the control room of your emotions, which happens to be the amygdala. And the amygdala will essentially either trigger a positive or a negative emotion. I like Snickers, or I don't like Snickers, or I want Snickers, or I don't want Snickers. And depending on whether it's a positive or a negative emotional response, that will drive a whole set of complex behaviors, either picking it out, unwrapping it and eating the bugger, or moving on and avoiding it or averting your eyes. And so your behaviors are actually triggered by that emotional response. Now, of course, when you consume a brand or a product, or there is, of course, a very, very rich feedback. And if the product experience matches the emotional expectations, then you've got a very positive feedback loop. If the Snickers bar was, let's say, satisfying, that will reinforce that positive emotion just that little bit more next time you see a Snickers bar. If you eat that Snickers bar and you feel sick afterwards, that will actually dilute that positive and actually may flip it to the negative. So the whole experience of a brand or a product is critical here. And therefore, if the emotions aren't aligned to the actual experience, of course that's not going to work. So that's hopefully a very, very simple way to explain how emotions work in terms of our decision making and our brand behaviors. Obviously, it's highly kind of conceptual, and I haven't put in all the complexity about media or shopping environments. But essentially, this is what is working in the brain. And then we need to ask ourselves what's the role of communications? Well, if it's this clear, the role of communications is to do whatever you can to attach a positive feeling to that brand. Because if my memories of that brand are positive and they're influenced by the communications I see about the brand, that will drive more of a positive emotion towards that brand. If the communications fail to do that, then I'm less likely to have a positive disposition towards the brand. And that really is the role of communications in its simplest form. And that is what leads a lot of the truisms that we at the agency kind of know, feel in our guts about the difference between emotion and reason. That the essential difference between emotion and reason is that emotion leads to action and reason will lead to conclusion. So again, it's not an anti-rationality theory that we've got here. It's just to put them in their right context and give them the right roles. Make sense so far? So now let's go back to the same study that Peter Field did, because he was, in his own way, trying to assess and evaluate the role of emotion versus rational. And this is what he did. He coded campaigns. It's very crude, I admit. He and his team coded campaigns based on either the write-up or the work as to whether they fell into one of three categories. A rational campaign, let's say a price promotion or a new product launch or something that was very information-led, and emotional campaigns, and then there were campaigns that fell in between the two. They probably blended or did a lot of the two. And you can see there, he assessed them against their ability to drive profit gains. And so just from his observation, he was coming up with support for this, that campaigns that were more purely emotional were more likely to drive significant large profit gains. Those that were purely rational were less likely. Yeah.
Would you, I don't know if you can do this off the top of your head, but can you give an example of a combined and one of a rational?
I think a combined would be, a classic, you see these quite a lot, where there's a nice slice of life with a happy family, with a big payoff, but maybe there's a little cutaway to, this is the detergent, and it does this and it does that. So the classic reason to believe kind of work, I could imagine would be combined. I'm guessing a little bit.
Rational is
just a pure, pure kind of information driven.
Andy, one more question.
Yeah.
Is there a time frame to this? I mean, when you compare it with the profit gains, is it measured over a period of time? Like,
that's a good question.
Emotional campaigns would be a little longer run, and rational would be a little shorter.
For what, the length of the campaigns, how long the campaigns ran?
When you start and when you measure the results.
I don't think he's controlled for that. I mean, he's evaluated the campaign in the time frame in which the evaluation was done. So remember, he's taking inputs of things that were already evaluated in terms of FE submissions that were both kind of client and agency endorsed. So I think he'd probably be taking his time horizon based from that.
Okay.
So that would take into account whether it was a long-term campaign or a short-term. And I know from FE some are 5 years long, or even 10 years long, and some are 3 weeks long. So I think he'll have taken that into account.
Depend on the category.
This is covering all categories.
And cultures? Countries?
This is global. Yeah, this is a global. It's got a little bit of a bias towards UK and US, just the availability of cases, but he's really reached out after Asia. And actually he's got a separate one I haven't got here, which is China, which is supposedly the most rational market, is just the same, actually. Yeah.
Where does willpower sit?
Willpower.
I would think the top school.
Oh, okay, back in the scoops. Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think willpower is the tussle between, is the platonic tussle between your emotional drivers and your rational behaviors. So I think, you know, willpower, if it succeeds, maybe your rational is containing or disciplining or controlling your desire to do X. If it fails, then the middle scoop wins. I think willpower is probably the interaction between the two. Remember, I mean, these scoops, I've put them very simplistically as independent, and they are quite kind of autonomous sections, but there's huge interaction between those, of course. I think that would be my guess where willpower is, because it's kind of almost, I shouldn't do this, but then you do. Yeah.
There's a recent, I was reading a book by Neil Kahneman called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. I don't know if you read it.
Great book, yeah.
And he is of the same view, except that he says that emotions actually making you trip over, so it's not disciplining you into going through the fatigue of all the rational choices.
That's right.
And so you basically landslide into the more convenient,
That's right.
emotive choice.
That's right.
Now, the interesting thing from this, that I remember a parallel, there was this visual illusion of two lines where the arrows are out and the arrows are in.
That's right.
And so if you've been exposed to it once, you know that they're both the same length.
Yes.
But your mind is telling you that the one with the arrows folding outwards is longer.
That's right.
So he says in brand choices, then you say, you know, screw that, I just feel this is longer, so I'm happy because I feel it's long.
That's right.
So in a sense, we are therefore pushing humans from being higher order, capable thinkers into being more reptilian in a sense, aren't we?
Well, I think what we're saying here is that our behaviours, our day-to-day behaviours, are more driven by that middle mammalian, the emotional sense, than we thought. Not exclusively, but certainly more than we thought. We all know that economics is built around a kind of rational animal, and that our choices, and we probably do it instinctively in our marketing strategies. If only the consumers knew the right information, they might make choices towards our brand. So we present them with the information, positive information towards the appeal of our brand. And I think what we're saying here is, relative to that model, the emotional response is actually critical in making that choice. And sometimes it can be overruled by the rational, but more often than not, it's stronger than we think, and it will be less influence than we think.
So in terms of reviewing decisions on communication, we should probably give greater weightage to things like likability and persuasion.
Absolutely.
Than to intention and understanding.
Absolutely right. I'm going to take this a little bit further, and absolutely right. And obviously we're going to air some of those discussions, but it's your feeling. I use the word feeling very choicefully because emotion, I know, can be a confusing or misunderstood word. It's your feelings towards the brand and the communications that drive its effectiveness at influencing a decision. It's the feelings.
The problem is, and I don't know if you're going to address this or not, I think a lot of us either try to move towards the rational argument, not because we don't understand that, but because when you put a group of people in charge of coming up with what the feeling is that's going to be generated, unless they have strong empathy skills, they're actually going to be really bad at it. So a great example is when I put a BBDO creative in front of certain people, they will look at it and decide whether it's good or bad, based on them using something that's kind of rusty, right? Which is, how is everyone in India going to feel about this? And walking them off that ledge is a lot more work than explaining to them rationally why that creative works and not bringing up the emotional, right? Because as soon as you bring up the emotional, it's like walking into an art gallery. and trying to explain to someone why something is good, people will have their instinctive reaction, and the best decision makers on something like that are going to be people who have empathy.
That's right.
Right?
Who are in tune with their emotional
Which is
response.
tough.
But maybe we have to create a distinction between how we sell the work internally
Which is exactly
to
what
how
we
we,
do.
to the work that we create that's going to work best for the brand.
Absolutely. And one of the things we do, and I think Ajay and Josie know it, is we don't ask everyone.
No.
Yes.
We kind of tell people,
Yes.
this is creatively amazing.
Yes.
And then we move on to, does it have enough of your specs in it?
Yes.
Because otherwise, you're having a debate and there's a different, you're playing baseball and somebody else is playing basketball.
I'm with you. I'm with you. And again, for obvious reasons, all this is happening as pre-lingual. All of this was evolving before we had any language skills. So that's why it's very, very hard to articulate and also to introspect. Our introspection's coming from your your front cortex.
Right.
Your ability to access this stuff. I mean, it's called the unconscious for a reason.
Right. And it's hard to turn to someone and say, well, they say, well, I feel this way when I see this, and say, well, 99% of people feel differently than you. You're wrong.
That's right. That's right.
So
Yes. It's very,
how do you
yeah.
have those conversations?
And obviously huge implications for research. The research methodologies that can tap into what's going on here
Right.
is gold dust. And again, I know there's a lot of work going on there, but we're not there yet, in my view. Most research methodologies.
Do you think in MBA schools now there's greater understanding of the role of empathy and the ability to understand human behavior or shared values or elements that create intuition, elements that create a more feeling and tone-based language? Is that something that's happening? Do you feel that's happening?
Generally, or in our marketing
From what
community.
you've heard, and because like recently I was asked to speak at ISP and I picked on this subject of empathy because I feel that people are coming out a bit too rational and therefore while their decisions are not rational, they think their decisions are rational, but if they could come to terms with how they really decide, then they can become more effective as managers when they come and meet people like us. In a way, I was trying to make my job a little easier.
That's right.
Yeah. So I was just wondering.
Well, I mean, it's beginning to come
It's a great
right.
point to raise.
Yeah, obviously, the concept of emotional EQ, emotional intelligence, is coming through. Interpersonal skills are becoming important. And I remember, even in the boardroom, decisions are being made based on emotion. The influence of people, the passion that people have, the status of the inputs. You make these big decisions are ultimately made for what feels right.
It's not happening.
Focuses only on data rich rational thinking. Whereas I think companies are realizing
You're from IM Bangalore.
companies are realizing that emotions play a much greater role. And companies are putting on numbers to understand that and put as an important and put their emotions over there. Because the brain has a way to make decisions rather than make decisions.
The barriers are huge. I mean, we've all got prejudice against emotion. Even in the language, oh, don't worry, that person's being emotional, is like a huge insult. But we're all being emotional. So just in our daily lives, the part of this platonic thing, emotion's got a really bad rap. And it's seen as dissenting or weak or subjective or what have you. But in fact, it's the other way around.
So all this will come into play next year when we go to vote. It's going to be interesting.
Don't start there, otherwise we'll never finish the presentation.
Of course you vote from emotion. I mean, we've seen all the data. I don't know the Indian data, but how many times the best-looking president's been voted in, or the most important attribute,
We don't
the
have
most
that
important.
problem.
I don't know how manufacturing got it in the UK.
Very good looking option.
But the whole, especially in the new media, the guy you want to have a beer with, drives.
So what happens when everyone starts creating these emotive campaigns? Everyone is in the same category, like in hospitality, like Taj or overall they have. Everybody starts creating emotion-led campaigns. So would there be a rational element that then comes in? Just like the brand that you want to choose? Or
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it's something which we'd like to explore. You obviously need to have emotional distinctiveness. If they're all coming in with the same emotions, then it's going to be a mess and confusing for the consumers to choose. I don't know. I think I think it'd be fair to say that the brands that have been armed with the most powerful emotional bank or response are the more effective ones, the more powerful ones.
I think it's also important to make the distinction that emotional doesn't mean there isn't intellectual thought.
Absolutely
So
right.
what I mean by that is when I want a GE ad to go out into the market, the point I'm trying to make is not to fool someone with emotion.
That's right.
It's to convey the message that if I have empathy in the country, if I understand the needs of the country, that is likely to mean, and if I show that to you through a clip, then it's likely to mean I am solving the country's biggest problems, right?
Yes.
So the idea is not to separate intellect from emotion.
Absolutely right. No, they're not distinctive at all.
And
Not
rational doesn't necessarily mean intellectually strong either.
No, that's right. And emotional doesn't mean intellectually free.
Exactly.
It's just, and that's why they are working together. They're not either ors, and that's been always my instinct. When we say it's either rational or emotional, as if it's a choice, they're mutually exclusive. That's absolutely wrong. They're two sides of one coin.
Too often we think EQ is non-intellectual,
Correct.
and the reality is it's not EQ. It's a combination of IQ and EQ that creates emotional responses.
For sure, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Okay. So we had those business results there just generally, and then what Peter did was break it down into different forms of commercial objective, more like marketing objective. The question was asked about effectiveness, and as we said, it was all commercial, but commercial does come in different forms, whether it's a sales objective, a share objective, price elasticity, loyalty and penetration. Now, the relative heights of these, it just reflects the frequency of the stated objective. So, it just so happens that price elasticity, very, very few campaigns had a stated objective to drive price elasticity. But you can see that no matter what the commercial objective was, it was those emotional campaigns that were more likely to drive very large effects.
There is actually a case, Peter makes a case very strongly that we should be, so this is based on what objectives the planners and the marketers set for the advertising. And his case is that actually too often we don't think about price as a primary objective. As actually the core role of this advertising is to justify a price premium. And then elasticity point is it's a double. You get double the effectiveness through generating a better price point than you can through necessarily top-line sales growth. And that we should be thinking more about that as we're developing campaigns to set that as a specific objective.
The reason I think why this is so important, he says, is that this goes straight to the bottom line. I mean, you're driving basically high margins if you're choosing this objective. So he does make a plea for that. And surprisingly, well, maybe it's not surprising that emotion drives essentially premium value or perceived premium value. Willingness to pay more is best driven by emotional arguments. Arguments that appeal to one's desires, self-worth, sense of pride, etc., rather than features. And then he compared against kind of softer brand metrics, and you see huge differences there. Even things like apparently, supposedly rational, things like quality measures. It was emotional, was still beating up. You'd imagine, image, you can understand that, and commitment, but even the harder, more concrete components of brand were more effectively achieved through emotional campaigns. So Peter's data seems to be corresponding now with the brain data, and that's what I'm trying to do, is provide a kind of cognitive or a scientific driver of Peter's results. But I'm not satisfied, because I don't think this discussion has already given us a clue that discussions of emotions is very, very difficult. It's hard, it's such an elusive concept. And I think that if we're evidence-based, if something's elusive to our analysis, we should rightly be skeptical of it. Unless you have a theory or a science of emotions, it's just fluffy. And I kind of get that. And that's what's driven me to go a little bit further. You've got to ask the next question. What's triggering emotions? What's going on that's triggering emotions? I've just talked about fear and stuff. Where's that coming from? I've said it's coming from the middle part of the brain and the amygdala, but exactly what is going on? And only once we know that, then we can see where creativity plays a role. So there's still a fair amount to go. And I think what I'm going to do is, again, by definition, it has to be quite simplistic. But I'm going to introduce two chemicals, this is where we get to the chemistry, that are really at the heart of it. And as I was uncovering this for myself, my eyes were just lighting up. The role of things like dopamine. I'm going to talk about dopamine and oxytocin. And once you understand more about these things, you understand how powerful these are in our everyday feelings, emotions, and behaviors in our everyday lives. And I'll just try and spend a few minutes describing things like dopamine and oxytocin. So I'll start with, and there are others, right? But these seem to be the biggest, most pervasive ones. There are things like endorphins and serotonin, and these other so-called feel-good chemicals. And there are also negative ones that are associated with stress, like cortisol, etc.
What is the other one? Sorry, the other chemical?
Serotonin, endorphins.
No, we just...
Okay, fine. Well, I'll come to that. Don't worry. I'll come to that. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. These all have it's all going on, man. Right. So let's start with dopamine. Right. This is rock and roll, and sex, and drugs. Okay. So this is dopamine's first for a reason. You'll see why. So this is a bold statement, and I'm probably exaggerating a little bit, but I don't think by that much. That dopamine is responsible for all things ever achieved by humans ever. Dopamine is what drives us to achieve. If you think about why the fuck do we achieve anything? Why can't we just sit around and munch mangoes or whatever? What gets us up, out there, working, doing stuff? It's dopamine. What does dopamine feel like? A slide that pulls it into its purest form. This is what dopamine feels like. Right? I don't know if it's Yuvraj or Dhoni. Dhoni may not have an emotional center at all. He's such a fucking cool guy. Right? But that is dopamine. Right? Well, that feeling that was conjured out, the feeling of success. And
it's already happening now.
I'm really getting into this now. So yes, that is the feeling of dopamine. It comes up in all our walks of life, as you'll see. It's the feeling of success. It's a biologically rewarding loop here because it drives us to hunt, drives us to go shopping, drives us to go on e-commerce. It fuels our pursuit. It helps us expend energy focused on a goal. And often, originally, when the goal was prey and food, that's obviously a self-rewarding thing. Those with the greatest amounts of dopamine were more focused, more goal-orientated. They probably ran faster and they caught bigger prey. Now, it's not just food that we hunt for, it's mates that we hunt for as well. So dopamine is the thrill of the chase. We all know the thrill of the chase. Not just the guys, the thrill of the chase. Right? The thrill of the chase as we go through a dating and seduction process, we're being driven by a goal. And the goal is obviously, you know what the goal is. But going up to and including the goal, you're driven by dopamine. What happens after is oxytocin, as you'll see. But essentially the thrill of the chase as we hunt for mates is certainly there. Dopamine is what triggers discovery. It's what triggers physical movement. Dopamine is, as you'll see in a minute, is triggered by novelty. The brain is seeking out novelty. It's seeking out and trying to understand and master novelty. So when we see novelty, dopamine is triggered. When the novelty is processed in a negative way, cortisol is triggered as well, and we run away. But when it's positive, dopamine is triggered. So that is what has fueled our movements around the world, our discoveries, both historically but also personally, travel. Dopamine is what drives our quest. Bigger, higher, further, space travel, going to the gym, whatever it is, that sense of physical achievement is driven by dopamine. It's that feel good. You feel good when you achieve something. And that feeling is dopamine running through your brain. Think about homework. Think about writing a PowerPoint. Think about doing a presentation. Think about anything that is mental or intellectual, like we heard earlier. It's the combination, things that have been done, solving an engineering problem, doing your maths homework, that sense of achievement when you do it is driven by dopamine. But the point I'm about to make is that it's not just the achievement, it's the anticipation and pursuit. So the dopamine is being triggered that fuels us to continue, to overcome barriers, to fix mistakes, to actually put things right, to get things right, is being driven by dopamine. It's an incredibly powerful force within us. And you look at the gaming world, gamers get this. Everything's a little task, whether it's getting onto a leaderboard or just eating a munchkin or doing whatever, finding the special prize or the treasure. Everything is driven in gaming by dopamine. Just this little small doses of move on. And then we all know how powerfully addictive it is. Here's what happens with dopamine, is you kind of uncover the mechanisms by which it works. I talked about anticipation. We all know Pavlov's dog and the brain's ability to associate with an expected outcome. And what happens is that the dopamine is released, originally it's released when you get the reward, and that's nice, it feels good. But then when you get the expectation of the reward, dopamine is triggered earlier. So what you're having is basically dopamine being triggered as an anticipation for a reward. And that is the difference between wanting and liking. If you like something, that's the response to the reward. But if you want something, that's a future behavior. And it's the same thing. That is the mechanism of dopamine moves us from appreciation of indulgence to actual anticipation and desire for something that's yet to arise. And that is what marketing is all about. So I've got no proof of this, but I can see a huge amount of parallels between the dopamine mechanism and our marketing mechanism. We're trying to create desire. So the expectation of a good result is being driven by dopamine. And it responds well to uncertainty. That's another, again, a very interesting physiological factor about dopamine, is that if you provide a reward 100% of the time, the dopamine level is a constant and actually trails off. You kind of get used to something, and therefore the desire falls off. But when you provide unexpected reward or unexpected novelty or unexpected achievement, the dopamine goes crazy. It really, really goes up, and then you seek it. So that is why we seek out novelty and uncertainty. And that is why we're all well, not all of us, but a lot of us are gambling addicts. Because it's that expectation that fuels a completely irrational desire just to go on the next one. What if? And it's not just the slot machines, it's just life. We're very, very optimistic. We're always seeking out the what if and the future because we love the idea of things coming up, uncertainty. And it's known that we can't compute probability well at all. And it's our emotional center that's overcoming that. Cocaine, essentially, as far as I can tell, as far as I've read, triggers dopamine. And it creates a sense and a feeling of achievement that may or may not actually exist. So that is why, that explains why, allegedly, it gives you a sense of confidence and achievement. Think of social media, the addictiveness we've got to have our posts liked or what have you. We become almost social addicts in social media. It's incredibly sticky. That's probably the drive of Facebook. It's being fueled by dopamine. Have they responded? What are they saying? Am I liked? Am I respected? Am I being answered? Am I relevant? All of that feedback we're getting through social media is dopamine. And then, of course, we've got scarcity and desire that we get in promotions, in what have you. The idea of getting something scarce is a sense of achievement. And that is being fueled by dopamine. That's why scarcity drives appeal. So when you break it down, a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted in marketing terms, and we can explain in kind of theories of marketing, fundamentally it's dopamine that's driving, as far as I can tell. It's this, which one is it?
It's
this one.
No, that's the next one.
This one. A couple of oxygen and hydrogen atoms. Yeah. Okay, so that's dopamine. Now let's just examine what this has got to do with creativity. And I'm going to show some work from India, some work from abroad, some work by our agency, some work by other agencies. But again, if this logic is right, if the parallels are true, the job of communications is to trigger the spurt of dopamine. And if we trigger the spurt of dopamine in association with the brand, get those connected, the next time you see the brand, that dopamine will be re-triggered, and then you'll like it and you'll move towards it. In very simplistic terms, that's what I feel the job of communications is. As I said, there are clues to how dopamine works that we can then connect with creativity and what we know to be true about creativity. The first is surprise. We always say the role of creativity is to surprise. Now we think it's to get your attention, that's true. The top scoop is oriented towards surprising things. You focus on things that are surprising. But the surprise also drives an emotional response that feels good. And so, an ad that I love, and you'll see the role of music and all of these things. I'll touch on music in a while. Music is proven to trigger dopamine. This is just an ad. We've all seen it before. Some of these are old favourites, but it's just worth reminding ourselves that it's the surprise that you see in this ad that triggers the sense of dopamine, helped along with a soundtrack as well. Is there some sound? So, you get that surge of like, wow, what the hell? And when the gorilla starts playing the drums, and that's just I'm sure that's a surge of dopamine going on. I wouldn't really call that an emotional ad. That's why I don't like the word emotion, but it's certainly designed to trigger and elicit feelings. And that feelings of, go. And obviously you can now observe the role of music is incredibly powerful. It somehow can go straight into the amygdala. It doesn't get processed out by the cortex. Music has an ability to go straight to the amygdala and trigger mood and feelings almost directly. And that combination, as I'm sure it was deliberate, where the surprise happens just at the crescendo of the Phil Collins track, is just awesome. It all comes together at that moment, and you can't, you obviously want to see it again and again. So surprise, again, this is a palette, an ingredient in the creator's palette that we know works, we instinctively know works. Hopefully I'm providing a little bit of a scientific basis of why it works and why it's important in driving pro-brand behavior. The other really interesting thing I've found is that storytelling promotes and triggers dopamine. Now again, we all go to the cinema, we all spend, how many hours of our precious free time do we spend watching stories, either in film or in person or what have you, telling stories or what have you. And storytelling has always intrigued me as the power of storytelling over other forms of presentation, PowerPoint or logical presentation. Storytelling is not a logical way to convey events or meaning. And what seems to be happening from the literature I've read on storytelling has now been proven to elicit dopamine. And what seems to be happening is that the listener to the story is not only projected, obviously with the right character projection, is projected and engaged in the storyline, but now they're curious about what will happen next. That's why plotline is so important. That's why cliffhangers and suspense are so powerful in the way we kind of listen and the way we kind of feel We feel, that's why suspense movies have suspense in them, because we want to know what's going to happen next. And that's a dopamine reaction, because we want to know. We need to achieve, we need to master, we need to know what's going to happen. And that's a feeling of dopamine going on. So that seems to be why storytelling is so powerful, why it can trigger such powerful emotions. Just the plot aspects. I'm not even talking about the other aspects of storytelling and being evocative. And that's why plot twists, again, provide very powerful advertising. Surprises, suspense, etc. It's back to the surprise, but in a story format, it's very, very powerful. And you see that in a lot of advertising, why it's so powerful. And if, of course, the brand can be injected just at that moment of truth when the plot twists or goes somewhere interesting, that's fantastic. Here's an ad that's come out of the US for one of our most successful brands, Guinness. You may have seen it, you may not have seen it. I'll just play it for you. So it just really kicks you. So you start with all of the team sport and the conflict and who's doing the goal, and that in itself is probably releasing some dopamine about the sport you're watching, a piece of sport play out. And then you see obviously the wheelchair narrative underscores the overcoming the odds, the bravery, etc. And then it just kicks you at the end. It's just really gets you, and that feeling of just wow. That's what we're striving for. That's the philosopher's stone. That's the holy grail. That kind of, wow, you've got me. And those are the feelings, I think it was raised earlier. The more we can, when we evaluate and develop and present, be more attuned to what's going on there. It's often there at the heart for some reason, we feel it, the better. And perhaps it's incumbent on us to kind of co-develop tools, methods by which we can articulate and isolate these feelings and thereby discuss them and build on them. Or, you probably recognise this one already, or, I've talked about travel and climbing mountains, stuff that makes you just go, wow, how do they do that? It can be human, it can be engineering or whatever, just when you look up at a mountain or a huge building or a wonderful piece of art, that sense of awe, or the skies. That sense of awe, I think, is dopamine. So let's play this. Let's add to the 50 million that have seen this in the last 10 days. Have you seen this?
I've had my ups and downs, my fair share of bumpy roads and heavy winds. That's what made me what I am today. Now I stand here before you. What you see is a body crafted to perfection. A pair of legs engineered to defy the laws of physics, and a mindset to master the most epic of splits.
Who can say where the road goes, where the day flows? Only time. And who can say if your love grows as your heart shows? Only time. We gotta
senior client of ours said that was the single best advert he's seen in his life. Career. Sorry? I know, I'm sorry, I should have realised. Sorry, Joseph. Music. I mean, music, I don't have a big theory on music, I just know it's powerful. And I'm a planner, not a creative, but my plea is that to have more music in our toolbox and more prominent and more invested in, because the power of soundtrack, whether it's a voice or whether it is music, is incredibly powerful and often overlooked by the rational. And music drives mood and it drives emotion, as we know. And you know, the stronger the music, the more powerful the response. I'm sure you've seen this one.
Refreshing lemon flavor ऐसा कि दिल बोले I feel
So there's music there, but you can probably now, you know, as we expose these things, you can now see other aspects that seem to be working well for it. The surprise, the juxtaposition of a dancing penguin. It's surprising, and the brain's going to respond to that, and you know, it's a pleasant surprise, and therefore we think that's going to release positive dopamine. Laughter, again, proven now. It triggers dopamine. No one's quite nailed what laughter does from an evolutionary point of view, but it certainly reveals, you know, it triggers dopamine, and we all know that, you know, things are good when we're laughing at them usually. So humour plays a huge role. I don't need to show too much around humour. I think problem solving. We talk about the twinkle in the eye. We talk about getting something. And obviously you don't want to make anything too arcane or difficult for the consumer, but the idea of kind of little visual puzzles or even verbal puzzles that you kind of have to problem solve against triggers a reward. Often creators will say, well, you know, the reward, you know, you get rewarded for understanding it. I'm sure you all remember the the Oreo Twitter campaign that was celebrating its 100th birthday, and it was using the Oreo as a kind of visual design to release, I think it was every day or every week, topical, relevant commentary on things that were going on in the US. So it was Gay Pride and Star Trek Day and Elvis Week, etc. And just using the Oreo as a kind of cute way to depict essentially what was a twinkle in the eye, incredibly digestible and shareable. And when we think about social media, these are great kind of clues as to the content that will drive it. And again, when you receive that little thing in your inbox and you go, that was cool, that's dopamine. So just a very quick whistle-stop tour about dopamine. And the more I urge you to read a little bit more about it. Yeah, the more you read about it, the more you realise how central it is in the way we kind of operate and the parts of our lives it seems to find itself in. So oxytocin is the other one I wanted to talk about. If dopamine is about achievement, oxytocin seems to be what's responsible for trust. So I'm now going to move into a more kind of interpersonal zone here. And obviously, you know, we're interested as marketeers about commitment, trust, loyalty, and those things. And it seems to be that oxytocin is the neurochemical that's driving those emotions of trust, loyalty, love, bonding, etc. Now, I'm making a huge leap to say it's oxytocin that's responsible for our connection with brands. I haven't got evidence for that, but I'm just saying oxytocin is certainly responsible for connections between individuals and species. It's actually been traced back to the octopus, and you know, mating behaviours, so on and so forth, is all driven by oxytocin. So let's just examine what this is. And again, a big, bold exaggeration, partial exaggeration, but you know, there's got to be some mechanism for how we do this. It's not just random, you know, and it's oxytocin that drives trust, love, family, reproduction, friends, communities, cities. Yeah, we are a social animal, and it's been driven primarily by oxytocin. There are, of course, other things going on, but oxytocin seems to be the driving force. If you don't mind, I'm going to play a slightly longer video as I introduce this. Oxytocin is getting popularized quite a lot. There's a lot of snake oil around oxytocin. But there's a video I just want to show that explains it better than me. It's a scientist who's really studying oxytocin and its role in generating behavior. And this kind of touches on the power of oxytocin, what it does and what triggers it, and then also actually talks about storytelling. So I thought it kind of talks a lot about some of the themes that we're here. So bear with me, it's about 4 or 5 minutes long, if that's okay.
I want to tell you a story about a little boy named Ben. Ben is 2.5 years old, and Ben has brain cancer. And Ben's really happy. He's happy because he's been through 2 rounds of chemo and radiation, and he feels good for once. He doesn't feel yucky, and his father's enjoying seeing Ben's happiness. But as the father tells the story of Ben and his cancer, the father's voice begins to break. And he says, it's very difficult to play with Ben, because Ben thinks everything is wonderful, but I know something that Ben doesn't, that Ben's dying. And he talks about how difficult it is to play with Ben, knowing that in 3 or 6 months, Ben will be dead. And yet Ben is so happy, he's so beautiful, and so the father tries as hard as he can to enjoy Ben, to be joyful around Ben. But then he says in the middle of this short story that it's an amazing thing to know how little time one has left. And as he says that statement, he has merged himself with his son. It's as if the father himself is dying. So in my laboratory, we've studied this story extensively. What we found is that 2 primary emotions were elicited. One is distress, and the other is empathy. At the same time, when we asked people what they felt after the story was over, we really couldn't get very clear answers. So we began doing other studies on this story. So we took blood before and after, and we found that the brain produced 2 interesting chemicals. One is called cortisol, which focuses our attention on something important. So cortisol correlated with our sense of distress. So the more distress you felt, the more cortisol you released, and the more you paid attention to that stimulus. The second chemical release is called oxytocin, which is associated with care and connection and empathy. And oxytocin was correlated with people's sense of empathy. And the more oxytocin they released, the more empathic they felt towards Ben and his father. Now, we did something different after this experiment. We gave individuals a chance to share money with a stranger in the lab. And indeed, those who produced both cortisol and oxytocin were more likely to donate money generously to a stranger they couldn't see in the lab. In another experiment, we gave individuals a chance to donate money to a charity that works with children who are ill. And indeed, those who released oxytocin and cortisol donated money to this charity. In fact, the amount of oxytocin release predicted in both cases how much money people would share with a stranger or with charity. What we're seeing is that this narrative is changing behavior by changing our brain chemistry. So we decided to go a little further and ask, could we actually predict before they watched the video who would donate money to charity? So with funding from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, we reran the study in which we not only took blood, but now we measured heart rate and skin conductance and respiration. And using these additional measures, we were able to identify this distress response and this empathic response, and we could predict with 80% accuracy who would donate money to charity. These individuals were paid about $20 to begin an experiment, and the people who donated money on average donated half their earnings. So we began to investigate this story further. We used functional brain imaging to identify the regions of the brain that were most active while watching that video compared to a control video in which Ben and his father were at the zoo. And what we found was that the most active areas for the emotional story were areas of the brain associated with theory of mind or understanding of what others are doing, and areas that are rich in oxytocin receptors that make us feel empathy. And guess what happens when you watch 100 seconds of a father and son at the zoo? Nothing happens and people just blank out. there's no reason for them to attend to this information because nothing's happening. There's nothing exciting. It's important to understand that stories have to have this particular structure. 150 years ago, a German theorist named Freytag called this the dramatic arc. So there are particular story aspects that go into making an effective story: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and then it's denouement. The story of Ben and his father talking about knowing his son is dying has those aspects. It captures their attention. There's a coming climax. How can Ben's father actually engage with his son in this wonderful, relaxed, playful way, yet knowing that his son will die soon? It seems like there may be a universal kind of story structure. So stories are powerful because they transport us into other people's worlds, but in doing that, they change the way our brains work and potentially change our brain chemistry. And that's what it means to be a social creature, is to connect to others, to care about others, even complete strangers. And it is so interesting that dramatic stories cause us to do this. In these experiments, they do it in a very functional way. People are donating money because they want to help Ben and his father. And yet when we watch other stories or see movies, listen to music, the same thing can happen. We feel uplifted, we feel motivated, or we feel connected to others around us.
Interesting, isn't it? And so this is just an example of the kinds of things that are going on in the laboratory to help unfold, and the role of stories really coming into it. Just a little point about empathy, and again, I don't have a chart on it, but something that's worth knowing about is something called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are a set of neurons in the brain that pick up the emotions of people that we can see. So I don't know the details of this, but when you see a story unfolding in a cinema or in front of you, our mirror neurons can engage and interpret and actually directly action the emotions of the person that we're seeing. So we're literally feeling the emotions of the others, and that seems to be the kind of one of the bases of empathy that we've got. So oxytocin, just a little bit about oxytocin and where it's come from. It's been known about for many, many times. And I think it was first understood more around childbirth. So oxytocin is responsible for labour, and obviously that's incredibly extreme physiological behavioural responses when you're in labour. And oxytocin is partly responsible for that. And apparently in the 50s, when mothers were struggling in labour, they were given oxytocin to help facilitate their body's reactions. And obviously, when we're talking about a mother-child bond, incredibly irrational bond if you think about it. The amount of effort that the mum goes through to protect and nurture the child has got to be driven by emotion, and that emotion, again, is released in huge doses by oxytocin during childbirth. And that's why you get instant bonding between mother and child after childbirth. We don't yet know, scientists are looking to see whether oxytocin is actually triggered in the baby as well. Lactation as well, yes?
What triggers the bond between the father and the child?
It comes through, obviously we're exempt, or we're not privileged enough to have this level of oxytocin, but on the father I've come across intimacy, touch, all of those things is coming through on the father. So oxytocin, as you'll see, is not a female-only chemical, but bonding comes through physical touch and intimacy, as well as eye contact, actually, as well. So lactation, again, is known to release oxytocin, and I think we all know that the bonding, the role of breastfeeding in terms of the bonding between mother and child is very, very critical. Eye contact, as well, as you'll see, is very critical as well. Sex. Sex, the act of sex, the act of climax, releases oxytocin, fact. And that is why climax drives bonding, love, etc. So making love is oxytocin, driven by climax. Now I've heard, and it wasn't from a scientifically reliable source, that in females oxytocin is triggered in all occasions, but in males only in partial occasions when there is so-called love already existing from the guys. So you can just do a little blood test afterwards, and we can find out whether the guys are lying or not. to your point, intimacy, physical touch, skin contact, we know is critical for the social health of children as they grow up, and it's critical, of course, for our connection. If I'm going to try and meet somebody for the first time, we often offer skin contact with a handshake. And obviously, as we get more intimate, the more skin contact or the more physical contact happens, and on it goes. And so there's absolutely a connection between skin contact and intimacy and affection and bonding. The chemical behind it is oxytocin. Gifting, release, generosity and receiving. Gifting and receiving and giving releases oxytocin and drives bonding and trust between couples. It's not all lovey-dovey, by the way. So when you get into other aspects of group behavior and tribal behavior and social behavior, participation and co-action drives oxytocin. So putting on the same clothes and chanting the same songs and slogans and having the same shared language. Those of you who know more about movements understand these dynamics. Absolutely critical. And providing and releasing oxytocin so these guys feel more bonded and more of a brotherhood towards each other. And so tribal behavior is often driven by oxytocin. And that can lead actually to quite very strong protection, sometimes violent protection tendencies as well. So but it's driven by the connection and the brotherhood. And obviously you can see that the resources and risks you put to protect the tribe. And of course that is inherent in so many religious activities. The idea of being together, pilgrimage, fellowship, praying together, singing together, all of those things drive fellowship around causes, political causes, religious causes, etc. Karaoke, singing stuff, dancing together. Dancing, oxytocin, it is a mating dance. It's echoing or anticipating the climax that I mentioned a little bit earlier on. But singing together, if you want to get a good bit of team bonding, have a good sing-song. Ecstasy, the feel-good drug, the love drug, actually releases a lot of stuff. But oxytocin is key. Oxytocin and serotonin are the two key things, and that is what's responsible, and that's why it's so incredibly popular, along with other drugs. And then you've got vulnerability, the idea of being vulnerable, of sharing stories. There's a lot of interesting things going around vulnerability. And again, there seems to be oxytocin triggered that provides the basis of kind of trust and self-help. So again, lots of areas of our lives, particularly our kind of social lives and our interpersonal lives, seem to be driven by this one neurochemical. Not exclusively, but it seems to be at the centre of everything. As I said, it's behind mating behaviours of octopuses all the way through the evolutionary chain after that. So let's just imagine how some of those cues could be then used and deployed in communication. So we thought about intimacy, we thought about love, we thought about vulnerability. Wonderful spot from GE, from the US. I think this is it.
I've seen beautiful things. I've seen the sunrise paint the desert. Witness snowfall on the first day of spring. Watch fireflies dance about the evening sky. But the most beautiful thing I've ever seen was the image on a screen that helped our doctor see my wife's cancer was treatable.
GE Technologies help doctors detect cancer early so they can save more lives, bringing better health to more people.
So again, I'm sure you all felt something. Hold on to that feeling. That's probably been driven by it. It feels perhaps a little bit qualitatively a little bit different from the dopamine. Triggers lacrimosity as well. Talking of lacrimosity, this one always gets me crying. So let's just show it from Thailand. A bit more volume.
ว่าชิมที่มีค่าคืออะไรผู้หญิงคนนี้ชื่อต้อยจน ผัวทิ้งนี่คิตตี้บ้านแตกนี่แม็กโอเลโอเนี่ยโตขี้ขโมยเด็กทุกคนมีแม่คนเดียวกันแม่ต้อยคนที่เก็บเด็กพวกนี้มาเลี้ยงเป็นโรคมะเร็งอยู่ได้ไม่เกิน2 ปีแต่เธอบอกว่าโชคดีจัง2 ปีทำอะไรได้อีกเยอะเธอสอนเด็กๆว่าชีวิตที่มีค่าไม่ใช่ชีวิตที่ร่ำรวยมีเกียรติหรืออายุยืนแต่ชีวิตที่มีค่าคือชีวิตที่ตัวเราเป็นคนมีคุณค่าและทำให้ชีวิตคนอื่นมีค่าไทยประกันชีวิตเห็นคุณค่าของทุกชีวิต
So you can see how the creative directors and the film directors just know the tricks. We know that film is so powerful at eliciting these emotions. Another component that's relevant to oxytocin is about service, and I won't go into it too much around service. If you're in the service business, your ability to achieve trust and commitment and bonding with your customers is obviously critical, and how that gets translated through your service channels is obviously very, very important. Sometimes in advertising you can almost do advertising as service. I just wanted to show one that made me chuckle. It comes from it comes from the US. It's a Trident brand that actually ran out of stock, so they screwed up. And obviously it's a very bad category to run out of stock on, if your favourite brand of Sampro is not available. And they turned it around in a wonderful way, just to really, I guess, seduce, serenade and apologise to their customers in a very lovely way. It was an online thing. You type in your name and it personalises it to you, so you feel a sense of personal recognition, apology, and flattery, all in one go. And these seem to be consistent with oxytocin. So I'll be interested to know what the loyalty scores were. I don't have data on it, but I can imagine it was pretty good, the turning around situation.
Your name and calling out your name again, in case you didn't hear it the first time. Jenna, didn't mean to make you cry, didn't want to say goodbye. We're so sorry. We'll write your name across the sky. So here's a tender song. So take this coupon to the store.
Kind of interesting way to turn a real problem into an advantage. And obviously when you get into CSR and huge movements or participation activities, this really just brings a great sense of communality and harmony between your customers, and obviously it connects with the brands involved. So as you know, the Aviva Great Wall of Education was a tremendous drive to bring people together around a single cause. So again, lots of reasons why this can really elicit and drive particular emotions and it's driven by oxytocin. The last point is eye contact, and again, eye contact is a critical thing, and we probably know if we're parents or friends, the role and the importance of eye contact. And I just wanted to play one last one, which I was told that the success of this was not only down to the humour and the delivery, and it's just a great ad, but actually it's the eye contact between the person you'll see and the audience, which is female, that really drove the key engagement. So it was a very specific cue, and I didn't realise the power of the eye contact apparently had in driving this. Again, I think we'll know this one.
Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me. But if he stopped using lady-scented body wash and switched to Old Spice, he could smell like he's me. Look down. Back up. Where are you? You're on a boat with the man your man could smell it. What's in your hand? Back at me. I have it. It's an oyster with 2 tickets to that thing you love. Look again. The tickets are now diamond. Anything is possible when your man smells like Old Spice and not a lady. I'm on a horse.
So again, it's not exclusively the eye contact, but of course, we can now see elements of surprise, of storytelling, and all of those things that we heard from dopamine. So that is just, again, a very, very quick whistle-stop tour through oxytocin. And I just wanted to kind of start, before we move into a discussion, just start organising the 8 key takeaways that I think I've covered. First of all, behaviour is triggered by emotional response. Not in isolation of rational processing, but it's certainly triggered by emotional response. And emotions, as I showed, are actually triggered by physiologically proven phenomena, such as neurochemicals, such as oxytocin and dopamine. So it is a physical thing. Emotions are not fluffy phenomena, they are physically caused. And as you've seen, neurochemicals, emotions, and therefore behaviour can be physiologically triggered by a variety of sensory stimuli that we in this industry call creative. So we've explored some of the creative devices and techniques that are actually causing or triggering neurochemicals, and those neurochemicals are driving emotions and thereby driving pro-brand behaviour. As a reflection, if you look at the huge success and pervasiveness of the music industry, the entertainment industry, the gaming industries, they really understand this phenomenon. When a lot of my research was actually uncovered by thought pieces from those industries, and by reference, I couldn't find much in this area from our own industry. So I think as an industry, we've got to really play a lot of catch-up. The gaming industry is going gangbusters because they get the role of achievement and uncertainty and probability. The entertainment industry gets storytelling and why it's so powerful. So we think emotion eats logic for breakfast. When it comes to the brutal decision of will this elicit an action, emotion is more important than logic. And again, in so passing, dopamine eats data for dinner. As I said, there's so much analysis going on in our world, so much processing of data. I'm fearful that we're missing the core point and the core crux of what creativity is, and that's about driving these neurochemicals. I think to harness these discoveries, we do need to take a think about how we're doing things, and I'm going to start a debate around that in a minute, about fundamental shifts about how we define our brands, how we develop communications, how we evaluate, how we present. I think there's a huge set of open questions that if we're going to take this evidence seriously, might have really powerful implications and might really generate some unfair advantage with these insights. And I haven't even started with research. Obviously that's a separate presentation. You can imagine what my views are on some of the research methodologies, but let's not go there. I'd rather spend our time about creative work, but yeah, the importance of research to tap into these understanding is key. Okay, so I'm gonna open up some discussion. I'm gonna present. I think there are about 4 charts that are kind of almost rhetorical points of discussion. I'm gonna open them up. I'll leave it to Ajay to work out how we're gonna have this discussion, whether we can do it as a group or whether we break into smaller parts or we just do it over lunch. But these are things that, the obvious implications. Sorry? Yeah, I think so. That'd be nice. Yeah. Shall I mean, we can do these one by one. Let's do these one by one. I mean, obviously, and I'd love your builds on this, is how, when it comes to defining our brands, how well are we defining our brands according to the emotions and feelings that are aroused by the product experience? Do we use our brand films as a measuring stick for all our communications? Now, I've made a very important point to connect product experience with the feeling. I'm not talking about emotions that are completely disconnected from the product performance. Running with a Nike should give you a sense of achievement as you run through the night on your exercise. And that feeling, the brand has consistently over time captured that feeling of success and competition and empowerment. We, as agencies, do those brand films, those wonderful things that are designed to elicit and define the emotion. But quite often in our day-to-day, they're not used as a guide to keep our communications true and powerful enough. We seem to kind of put them on the side a little bit. So these were just some thoughts that occurred to us. When it comes to define, if we believe that feeling and emotion is this important, are we doing enough to define it, capture it, and use it as we communicate?
I mean, perhaps one way to do this is to ask all of us what we got out of this. So
yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Okay.
It will be useful because it's after all a point of view that you have.
Or a comms person who's going to think about what we need to do in the digital space, how many of us come into work in it every day? And how often does a company remember to remind us what we're really engaged to be doing?
And what that feels like when it's right, when it's good.
And to me, that feeling is, that's correlated to this. If you do that well internally, then you do this well externally.
Yes, for sure.
I think there's a very interesting rise in the last decade, and it's known instinctively, but there's purpose-led brands that define themselves by their purpose, their greater purpose in life. And to some extent, that's a reflection of, we're not just a rational company that makes machines, we're a company that, drives some form of human purpose to which the consumer can align but in ways. And that's an emotional response to the company rather than just rational, I am employed by this company or I'm buying into this company. And you see, there was Jim Stengel, who was the former CMO of Procter & Gamble, did an analysis of the top 500 S&P companies. And he identified a series of characteristics which he defined as greater purpose, which in this presentation you could define as emotional attachment to the company. And he demonstrated dramatic stock market valuation enhanced performance of those companies versus the others that didn't have a purpose or emotional connection through to employees or to their stakeholders or to their customers. So it goes way beyond, I think, just communications.
And one of the mechanisms that's there, and again there's research about it, is productivity, individual productivity. When you're talking about incentives, obviously financial incentives and rewards get you so far, but when you're trying that space between adequacy and excellence, that gap is driven by a sense of purpose and mastery. So yes, it's
I mean, and it's also the era of authenticity and connectivity. If you're having internal meetings where you're just talking about making money, and you're showing advertising that's all about saving lives, that comes out. That comes out on Twitter or Vault or whatever the forums are.
Yes.
You can't contain who you really are.
Yes.
So that connection is
a very
really
interesting point. There's a very interesting point in your comment, which is that social media has got incredibly high EQ. They're not coming out with facts and stuff like that. Maybe they are a little bit, but the big attitudes and the big conversations are actually incredibly sensitive to the EQ of what's going on, what they're saying. If something doesn't feel right, they're saying it. even if they may not be able to articulate it, but the anger of a response or the positivity of the response is probably an EQ, a reaction of EQ, isn't it? Interesting. Yeah. Any other thoughts or reactions or questions, of course? Yes.